Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Drive Innovation Through Cloud Migration Happening Now. Our agenda is packed with insights, starting with the foundation of cloud migration, where we'll explore its benefits and challenge. We'll then journey through the stages of cloud migration, highlighting challenges and solutions underscored by Radiant Logic's experience. But before we kick things off, cloud migration offers immense potential for enhancing business agility, cost savings, and operational resilience. Today's discussion is a roadmap to navigating this complex landscape. Today, we're going to dive into the transformative world of cloud migration, guided by our experts, Venkat through Vendigam and Prashant Godi. Venkat is one of the pioneers of cloud technology and from more than a decade ago. He was an early engineer at Azure and the first developer and founding member in Azure's networking team. He wrote significant parts of Azure Compute and Network Controller Stack, where he saw Azure grow from 100-odd servers to millions of nodes in just a few years. After leaving Microsoft, he realized that such hyperscale automation techniques have not made their way outside of companies like AWS, Microsoft, and Google, which led Venkat to create DuploCloud with the goal to bring hyperscale automation techniques to mainstream IT. Joining Venkat is Prashant Godi, who is the VP of Engineer at Radiant Logic and is a leading strategic engineer for cloud-native initiatives and pioneered the successful launch of Radiant Logic's One SaaS platform. He has been with Radiant Logic for over 20 years and has experience leading all stages of product development, and has also led several high-profile engagements at large enterprise customers, providing subject matter expertise with technical leadership. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Venkat, who will lead us through the foundational elements of cloud migration. Venkat, the stage is yours.
Right. Thank you. Some of the main things in terms of cloud migration is that people take different approaches. One is that they tend to do it on their own. Sometimes they work with partners. So I think it's very important to pick the right partner, obviously. And then also, I think it's very important that while it may appear to be a very laborious mechanism, we should have something which is very outcome driven, in the sense that how do we basically pick a approach, partner, technology, which really is commensurated and compensated based on the outcome. So that's one part. The second part is that I think migration is only the starting point. Much of the work starts after you've already migrated into the cloud. You need to make sure that you're able to control the system. Cloud is very different than on-prem, so you need to know all the nuances, security, compliance, those kind of things have to be done on an ongoing basis and so forth. So I think those things are also very important. So it's good that as part of the migration and so forth, we work with partners who are able to put the customer in control. So I think it's interesting that there are a few things that are important to think about. So one is that cost savings, and I'll talk about that. Cost savings, productivity, agility, and resilience. So what does cost savings mean? So it's been a long debate about, does cloud actually increase the cost or cloud actually decrease your cost and so on. And I would put it this way: for a very large set of use cases, it can actually significantly lead to cost savings. So what does that mean? Especially, there are a few things which outright save you cost. Like, for example, when we operate in on-prem data centers, there isn't enough elasticity. So for use cases like DR, you end up paying for a DR site, although you are probably not using it, but you have to pre-allocate the servers and all that kind of stuff, right? So whereas in terms of cloud, all that you have to pay for is data storage, as long as you are replicating sort of that specific data components. Much of the infrastructure, compute, networking, all of that can be spun up runtime almost instantaneously. So that's like one avenue. Second avenue is that there isn't enough virtualization on the on-prem side. Is that, for example, if you don't have a large enough infrastructure, even then you have to go and buy your load balancers, routers, firewalls, and so on. Whereas in terms of the cloud provider, you just like, for example, if you have to buy an F5 in on-prem, it can cost you hundreds and thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars, whereas a load balancer in Amazon costs like $20. All right. So that's like another example where it can really save costs. So I think that's where you have to evaluate how much amount of what is this kind of infrastructure, what is the architecture, and it can lead to substantial amount of savings. Why? Because of elasticity, virtualization. So those are like the common themes. Second is staff productivity. Sometimes we tend to just look at these things purely as like how many dollars are we actually paying to the hardware vendor, whether it is an on-prem vendor or it is a cloud vendor. But I think a lot can be said about the man hours that you tend to put in order to maintain it. So we have to sort of like see how they substantially go down if you're operating in cloud for much larger size of infrastructure and maybe potentially more complicated and more productive towards the application. So that's that. Another thing is that sometimes people think of on-prem as CapEx in the sense that, okay, I bought a license and then I can amortize the cost over multiple years. But as a lot of us know, every company today wants to be in a subscription model, right? Because that's what drives the valuation and so forth. So people are really going away from perpetual licenses and so on. So even if you are on-prem, it might actually appear that you cannot treat the infrastructure as CapEx anymore. Operation resilience, I think I touched upon it, how you can, in a click of a button, go across like 7 regions across the globe and so forth, and fundamentally productivity, right? This probably is one of the most important things, that if you are an organization where you want to get your application out as fast as possible, product out so that you can go and test the market, go live and so on, I don't think there's anything that meets public cloud. So that's the business agility aspect of it. And then, yeah, you can put a cost to that, like the time to market. Um, so I think there are by and large three approaches to doing cloud migration. What does lift and shift mean? Lift and shift basically means that you just take the system which is on-prem, just replicate it as it is, including the operating system. I mean, you could be running another version of the operating system. They're like softwares like Cloud Endure and so on, wherein you drop in an agent, it just live replicates it into the cloud, and then you just cut over and then you go from there. You just basically move the entire thing. It may appear as if it is a simpler approach, but in my opinion, I think it has a lot of negativities, because for one, you're taking like so much stuff which you potentially don't need. The architecture which works on-prem potentially is not that great for public cloud. There are inefficiencies. Overall, I think your cost is actually going to be bigger if you do lift and shift. And this, I think, is by and large a settled argument now. And very rare do people actually do lift and shift. Then there is the aspect of redeployment. So what redeployment basically means is that, let's say you have an application which is running on, just as an example, Windows IaaS server, right? So you don't replicate at an operating system level. What you do is that you recreate the operating system, potentially the latest version of Windows Server, you reinstall IaaS, but you take the exact same binary and you deploy it in the exact same fashion. IaaS is IaaS, your deployment schemes sort of like remains the same. Now, the advantage of this is that it is quicker compared to lift and shift. It's, I would basically say, more or less it's similar, but some of the things you're able to modernize, you're able to get to the new operating system, you have a more up-to-date OS, diagnostic agent, monitoring capabilities, and so on. But I think you do miss a lot of, but getting to that agility of a cloud provider, wherein, with a click of a button, you can create another environment, another region, add more instances to the database, or through the load balancer and so forth, are somewhat limited, because techniques which are still VM based, whether it's Windows or Linux, are still harder to manage, especially with around Chef and Ansible and so on. So that's what brings me to the second one, which is really the repackaging thing. Repackaging basically means you don't change application code, or it's like really minimalistic, and you take it and you drop it into a Docker container. So once you drop it into a, like, lift shift it, but into a Docker container, and then you basically put it in Kubernetes and so forth, and then you get like really great benefits of the cloud provider. At least personally, when DuploCloud, whenever we try to do migrations, we always take the repackaging approach, containerization approach, because from our experience, we have always felt that it's a lot more work for us on an ongoing basis to actually do either lift and shift or redeployment. It may take a tad bit longer, but it's much better. But then I also say this because we have tremendous amount of expertise in doing that. So I think that's where the thing is. If you don't have expertise, probably you'll have to end up doing one and two. But if you have the subject matter expertise, you can actually do the containerization and go much faster. All right. And then the problem is settled. So someone who really knows probably can do containerization faster than potentially redeployment or even lift and shift. But lift and shift requires much lesser subject matter expertise, right? So that's sort of like the various different approaches. Finally, of course, there is an approach wherein you just rewrite the application for cloud. I wouldn't call that as migration. That's like replatforming, or maybe that requires a lot of application code changes. This is discussed in the scope of infrastructure and DevOps. All right. Typically, this is just sort of the infrastructure. How do we approach cloud migration, right? So what we tend to do is that first you draw a very high level diagram. You don't get into the nuances of security group and IAM roles. I'm talking AWS terms, but you can extrapolate it into Azure terms as well. But you don't get to that level of detail, but you just say that, hey, you know what? These are the application components. This is my web. This is my database. This is my backend. I'm using Redis. I'm using MySQL. I want to expose these components over an external load balancer. This is over internal load balancer. This is how my WAF looks. This is my VPN. And okay, these are my servers for, let's say SIM and so on. And I want to be in multiple availability zones. This is by and large a typical architecture. But of course, I mean, underneath it, it blows up into hundreds and thousands of lower level details. So that's sort of the first step that we come in and do. We identify the moving pieces. When I say, we call it deployment units. So what's a deployment unit? Deployment unit is like one base is basically, you can call it like a microservice. It can have like multiple replicas, but like, for example, a web front end would be one deployment unit. One backend microservice is another deployment unit, and it can have multiple replicas. That's fine. So we start by identifying the deployment units, what their high level dependencies are with data stores like database, Redis, and so on, and how they need to be interconnected in terms of networking and exposed out. So that's like the first sort of the step that you could potentially do. And this is the overall cycle that we have seen. So once you have drawn the diagram, then you go and create the base infrastructure. We call it like landing zones, like VPC, subnets, availability zones, and VPN and whatnot. So once you have that, then you put in place your boundaries, or we call it like environments. And what it means is that dev, stage, prod, how do you actually segregate them? Then you bring in the various different dependency services like database, Redis, OpenSearch, those kind of things. And that's what you do in the app services thing. So first is networking. Then you have these dependency services, typically data stores, caches, and so forth. Once you do that, then you bring in your app deployment mechanism, which is if it's a container, so I'm going to do Kubernetes. If you actually have a bunch of jobs, maybe it is Kubernetes job, or you want to use Lambda functions and so on. If you are using Airflow, for example, on-prem, then you'll have to create Airflow. You want to do big data, maybe there's CMR, like those kind of things, mostly around app provisioning. I would say progressively that as we are talking about, the volatility and the cadence of things changing increases. Like the base infrastructure probably changes the least, followed by the application services like databases and Redis and whatnot. And finally, when you do app provisioning, that's where you have a lot of changes going on in terms of new services, load balancers and whatnot, port opening ports, connectivity, service discovery, and so forth. Then you put in place monitoring. There's a lot of activity there, more, so to speak, read, wherein people are sort of like saying, okay, do I have all the alerts? Do I have all the logs? Do I have all the metrics? And then the last thing is that you have to put together the CI/CD aspects so that you can make all these changes. So you have to progressively migrate in these phases. You can call it almost stream, infrastructure stream, app services stream, app provisioning, monitoring, CI/CD. And all along, you have to make sure that you have security controls in place. And security in cloud this is like one big differentiator. What, from my experience, what on-prem security to a large extent, what you can largely do what you want to do in storage, compute, network, drop in a Palo Alto box in the middle of the network, pump all traffic to that, do all your security policy in that, and IDS and IPS and firewall, and then you can sort of be like done. And you don't really have to touch your storage, compute, network, the rest of the system that you already set it up, operating system. But in cloud, it's actually distributed. So security is there across all the streams. So you really need to make sure that you are very well read in security and compliance standards so that you can put security at each layer. So that's sometimes people tend to struggle, and then they do a lot of work and they realize, oh shit, I did not do encryption at rest in the database. If I have to enable it, I now actually have to delete the database, recreate the database. I cannot change the VM from one subnet to another subnet. It's not like we go to a vCenter and change the port group and the VLAN changes and we are done. Now Amazon will ask you to move it into another subnet and so forth. And the same thing with Azure and GCP and so on. I think being very well read in terms of security and compliance standard before you start the migration is very, very important. Because if you look at these controls like PCI, high trust, HIPAA, NIST, SOC 2, and so on, there are a lot of controls, but about 70% of them are provisioning time controls, meaning that you have to put in place, you have to know, okay, if you're going to do NIST, make sure that you create a cluster which actually has a private endpoint, as an example, a Kubernetes endpoint. For example, in Azure, if you create an AKS cluster which does not have a private endpoint, and later on someone tells you, hey, it needs to be a private endpoint, then you have to actually destroy the cluster and redo the whole thing. If you have the automation, that's okay. That's not a problem. But all I'm trying to say is that, I mean, imagine you put all the workloads and realize that, okay, I need to change it private, and then I have to do all this work. Not every cloud provider like that. In Amazon, that's not the case. Amazon, you can change it, but that's where you need to know what can be changed, what cannot be changed. You need to be really well read in terms of security and compliance. All right. So I think that's very important. And it's a very big difference between how you do on-prem versus cloud. These are like some of the compliance controls, like for example, creation of the VPCs, creation of the cluster, encryption at rest, encryption in transit. These are all provisioning time controls. Vulnerability detection, host intrusion detection, network intrusion detection, virus scanning, monitoring. These are all post-provisioning controls. And very interestingly, the much of the security industry, because they are, the companies are all, so to speak, companies from the enterprise computing era, their strength largely is actually post provisioning security. Like whether you do Prisma Cloud or Laceworks or Wiz and so on, they are not there when you actually have to create your VPCs, right? So they by and large come in after the stuff has been done. Security people come in, they push agents, they connect to their cloud provider, which has already been provisioned, and they're like, okay, these are all the things that you need to fix. Sometimes I've seen that you connect Laceworks to a customer account and it looks like a Christmas tree. It's like red, right? And then you have to go and go and fix it and so forth. So again, emphasis, be well read in security and compliance control before you actually start the migration. Transforming challenges. Yeah. So this is where I hand it over to Prashant and then from there.
Right. Thanks, Venkat. Thanks, James. And thanks, DuploCloud, for having me. So I'm going to just briefly talk about what Radiant Logic is and what we do. So we founded in like 1995, like way back, and we actually became kind of mainstream in 2000, early 2000s when we started in the US. What we do is we have specialized technology which basically integrates identities across an enterprise, and we basically provide a view. We pioneered a technology called identity virtualization, so we are pioneers in that. So we came up with a term called virtual directories. We basically aggregate identities from all over an enterprise's different data silos, and we make it look like a unified view, right? And there are multiple use cases for this, especially on the IT side, to manage your identities for your IAM, for SSO, and things like that, right? And we've been traditionally been an on-prem product, meaning we build our application, we package it, an installer, and give the software to the customers, right? And we let the customers deploy it, install it, and set up their infrastructure, and we provide guidance on how to do it, and that's about it, right? So we're mainly focused on the application. So we never cared about or worried about where that is getting deployed and how that is getting deployed and different things, right? From a point of view. So we were only focused on the application side. But at some point, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started looking at SaaS, right? Mostly it was driven by our customer requirements and requests, and the ability to make sure that we provide the service in the right way and not worry about which infrastructure we need to build this on. We had this problem of like, okay, the customer is running on Windows, customer is running on Linux, customer is running on a different type of operating system within Linux. So we had to package our product in all these different ways, right? And also we wanted to move we were actually on a perpetual license. So we wanted to move to a subscription license as well, right? So that's why we decided, okay, let's go the SaaS route. So SaaS was something new for us. So SaaS requires maintaining both the application and the infrastructure as well. So application, we were good, right? So that's what we've been doing. But infrastructure was something new for us, right? First thing, we didn't have the resources. So we have to build a brand new team to take care of the infrastructure and then build the architecture, right? So initially we started, okay, let's do it ourselves. How hard can it be, right? So it's you have these cloud providers. We can go to AWS, we can go to EKS or anywhere. But end of the day, you still need to come up with an architecture. We still need to write the code, infrastructure as code, build it, and deploy our application, right? So initially, we thought it was easy. But again, like I said, we are in an identity space, which mostly deals with security. So then things like security, compliance, right? Isolation, all those kind of things came into picture. Then we thought, okay, this is quickly getting complicated, right? So then we started looking at, okay, if we start building a team and do it in-house, it's going to take forever, right? Because this is new for us and we have to build the team and we need to go to market quickly, right? So that's when we started looking at different vendors and we looked at multiple vendors, right? And some had most of them did what we wanted, but we had some specific requirements, right? First thing is we wanted to go single tenant deployment, meaning every customer that we deploy a software for and manage their infrastructure, it's going to be single tenant and isolated, which means it's more expensive and the infrastructure costs are going to be more. Then we found DuploCloud, right? Then DuploCloud had this architecture where it basically provides all the automation, the security, the compliance that we need to deploy our product on SaaS, right? So tenant isolation, you can create a Kubernetes cluster, you can isolate the tenants, and you can have, mentioned previously, you can have built-in compliance when you actually deploy your infrastructure or your code. Infrastructure as code, you can say that, okay, I want to deploy something that complies to this standard, right? So from the get-go, we have this total tenant isolation, all the features, compliance, monitoring, security, everything built into the infrastructure, right? So it was pretty smooth. So we got in touch with the Duplo, and basically they had us up and running within few weeks, right? Not months or years or anything like that, but within few weeks. We had some initial discussions and then we did a POC for a month and then we were up and running. And the whole concept of how tenants work and how isolation work fit perfectly into our design, the way we wanted to deploy our software and provide software as a service, right? Currently, DuploCloud is an integral part of our whole ecosystem. The way we manage our infrastructure, the way we onboard our customers, the way we set up everything is automated end to end, thanks to DuploCloud. And we are able to set up within few minutes. When we get a customer, we want to migrate them. So traditionally, the kind of customers we get are that are deployed on-prem. So they're using our product on-prem on their own infrastructure, and they want to move to cloud, right? Instead of managing their own stuff, they want to use our SaaS service, right? So the migration, it's pretty seamless. From a product perspective, we did all the hard work that Venkat was mentioning previously, like the containerization, all those things. That was already done by us. So it took some time, but again, we had to repackage it and rebuild it. I mean, we didn't make significant changes on the application side, but we had to make some changes to package it as a container, right? So that was our first step. I mean, before we got engaged with DuploCloud, we'd already did that. So that kind of helped us like move in this direction pretty rapidly, right? Our time to go to market reduced significantly, right? Monitoring, security, compliance are the key things that DuploCloud helped us provide. When I say a single tenant, so it's basically a single Kubernetes cluster per customer, right? And per customer, it's basically like DuploCloud offers something called a tenant. So tenant is nothing but if you know the Kubernetes world, it's basically a namespace. So typically in a namespace is like a logical separation within a Kubernetes cluster. But what DuploCloud does, it made actually a physical separation, meaning not physically physical, but it made like those namespaces totally isolated by running them as like separate node groups, right? Namespace within the same Kubernetes cluster cannot access resources in another namespace, right? So this opens up a lot of possibilities especially if you are worried about security and isolation. At the same time, you can still save costs. Like you don't have to spin up dedicated Kubernetes cluster for each environment or each deployment that you need to do. So you can have segregations, like you can have within the same cluster, you can have a pre-prod, prod, you can have a QA, UAT environments and things like that. Right? So that's what we've been doing. Let's go to the next one.
I think this is typically the execution stages. I think first is that kickoff and discovery, assessment, project plan. So I would basically say and I'll speak for DuploCloud, like how we do it. We actually spend very little time in kickoff, discovery, and the assessment phase, so to speak, right? Because what we are saying is that first off, we come and say that, look, what are we looking at? Which type of migration are we looking at? Are we looking at lift and shift, or are we looking at basically sort of like the second one where we'll just change the OS, or we're looking at actually repackaging? We recommend to our customers strongly that if they can go with the containerization approach, and one of the differentiators that we do is that we basically say that, look, you know what? You don't need to have the expertise. We have all the expertise. Allow us to do that because we ourselves are going to be like very efficient in that. And why do we do that? The reason why, whereas a lot of the providers, consulting organizations, actually, that's where they make like a lot of money. They will charge you tens and thousands of dollars for assessment and maybe even potentially for modernization, containerization, and so on. I think the reason is that we are basically a product company and we care the most about subscription license post migration effectively, right? So that's really our business model. So we are not like an organization which can just migrate you whichever way you want and then move on. Like you would talk to us if you're interested in an ongoing operation, and because that's where I think the value of the cloud sort of comes in. Migration is like the first step. So we do migrations for free. Right. So we come in, and now if I have to maintain it, what would I do? If it was my infrastructure, I would containerize. So then the customer is like, well, I don't know whether the thing will work in containers or will it not. So we have some conversation, we talk about it. If it's a COTS application, we cannot, right? I mean, it has to come from the vendor or the ISV. But if it's not a COTS application, we say that, you know what, just show it to us how it works in a virtual machine, command line without containers, and then we'll take it up. We will basically write a Docker file and then go from there. There are some more nuances, but we have done it like hundreds and thousands of times. So that's how our project plan looks like. The first stage is containerization. In case of Prashant, they already understood that and they had already done it before they came to us. So then we just basically go draw that high-level architecture diagram. And the beauty is that that's all you need to do. You need to just draw the high-level architecture diagram, just choose the standard, and you can just choose NIST if you want to, because that's like the mother of all standards, right? So you pick the standard, draw a high-level architecture diagram, and you can just get going. You don't need to be well-read in compliance. You don't need to be well-read in security. You don't need to know what a managed identity is or what a resource group details are and so forth. And then you can basically go start creating an environment, and you can say, hey, give me an environment, enable it with Kubernetes. It should be in this particular region. Under that, create me a sub-environment, dev stage prod, and then you can start going deploy the application. So that's the deployment stream. So first stream is a very lightweight discovery that typically goes in a few calls. Second stage is containerization. If it has already not been done, then after that has been done, then it comes to the deployment stage. And after the deployment thing is done, we basically say validate it. And usually in the deployment stage, we have the customer work hand in hand so that they can see in the DuploCloud product what buttons are we clicking or what commands we are running and so on. So that way it allows them to be in control and they can take over. For example, let's say if you have 100 applications, we'll do it for 10 and then you can do the rest after that. Then once that is done, then we put all the monitoring things in place, which is also like just few commands like enable all logging, monitoring, alerting for this environment, and out of box it does a whole bunch of things. Like it'll get you there 90%. It will probably not do specific alerts with respect to your application, but it can basically do all the necessary alerts with respect to the infrastructure. Then we start writing pipelines. So then people test their dev environment, stage environment. So once that is validated, then we create the production readiness. And then that's where a very important aspect comes in of data migration, and which really depends on what is the format of data, how much is the data, and how much is the downtime that you can tolerate. Like, for example, let's say you have 5 terabytes of data and you have to bring it over. We can't actually have a downtime for days, right? So then you have to do something like a robocopy, which actually can do differential copy. You let it run for 2 weeks. And then by the time when you actually have the downtime, it will only take 10 minutes because the diff is not so much. So like those kind of things have to be figured out. But generally speaking, when you are working with us, there is no time and material. It is a fixed subscription cost purely based on the size of your infrastructure, because we are not after time and material for the duration of the migration. We really want to work with you as a software with support company. That you can basically operate well in the cloud after you're migrating versus like during the migration itself. So that's where the thing is. Sometimes people ask us, hey, you do free migration. What's the catch? The catch is that it is a subscription fee. The subscription fee goes on for a year, right? So that's really the catch. So that's sort of like our cloud migration executing stage. And then go. And then, yeah, these are like just standard, like what we have been able to do is that what we call it as tenant. It should not be confused with the Azure concept of tenant. Think of it like environment. You have like various levels of isolation. You can have 2 environments isolated by an entire account level. You can have them isolated at VPC level, or you can have them isolated as the next level, which is the tenant or an environment. So account is one-on-one, VPC one-on-one, but what is a tenant? Like Prashant said, tenant is the next layer of isolation. It's like basically it's made up of a namespace, security groups, IAM role, instance profile, PEM key, KMS key. This is more in the Amazon world, Azure world, manage identity, resource group, ASGs, and so on. So effectively, what we have done is that we have created multi-tenancy within the AWS account. So that's that. So we can go next. Think of it like this. You can basically say whatever Kubernetes did to whatever Kubernetes namespace is doing to Kubernetes, we have created a namespace that expands all the way into the cloud infrastructure. And then you have these typical architectures in which you can have like the horizontal dotted boxes are showing that tenant level, which is what like Prashant was appreciating, that it's not just simply the namespace, it goes all the way down into the entire AWS account. Like you have separation, if you like, at a node group level, IAM, security groups, instance profiles, and whatnot. And then you can cover like multi-region deployments. Whatever you did, you can just replicate into the second region. Yeah, keep going.
This is actually, yeah, this is our deployment. So just wanted to give a high level overview of what we were able to do, right? The Kubernetes cluster is what infrastructure is. I mean, the in DuploCloud terms. So DuploCloud basically manages that. So within that, we were able to create those isolated swim lanes that you saw previously, which we call them as environments. So environments is where an instance of our product runs, right? So we are able to run like, we create a services tenant, which basically provides some kind of a control plane to manage our different environments. And through that, we have a full stack of open source tools that you can see there that we use. And then we are able to create these isolated environments within the same cluster, right? So again, Currently, this is a single tenant model, meaning like each customer gets a Kubernetes cluster, and within that cluster, this tenant isolation is what we use to deploy our environments, right? So an environment, again, is equivalent to a tenant, which is a namespace where we deploy our instance of our application, right? Yeah, so I mean, this is like a brief overview of architecture, but again, all the infrastructure that is backed by DuploCloud, and that's where like we are able to easily deploy and manage our entire SaaS platform through DuploClouds. I mean, they provide like a cool user interface, and also they have API calls. So we have some integrations with API calls as well, right? So, and one neat thing is the way we built this is it's cloud agnostic as well. So it's not tied to AWS. We can take the same architecture and then put it in Azure or GCP or any cloud provider, right? So our core is built on Kubernetes, Helm charts, and all the manifests. And Duplo Cloud provides the infrastructure. Again, they have cloud agnostic interface, right? So we use their APIs, and we use their Terraform provider, which is pretty seamless. And just by switching, so I mean, if you want to write Terraform code for AWS or EKS or GCP, you have to basically rewrite the entire code, right? Instead, Duplo provides a provider which you can just switch, saying, okay, instead of AWS, I want to do the same thing in Azure, right? So you just change one variable, and that's it, right? So they provide some kind of an abstraction, an interface that allows you to switch to providers easily. Good, Venkat.
Yeah.
And
So yeah, I think
sorry.
in general, I would basically recap it this way. I mean, definitely cloud migrations are hard and expensive, and it really comes down to subject matter expertise, right? I mean, this DevSecOps thing is like a skill wherein you need to be a programmer so that you can, write code, the infrastructure as code. You need to, or rather, do Dockerization and stuff. Then you need to be an operations person who understands operation. You need to know security. You need to be well read in compliance. I mean, come on, how many skills can one individual have, right? And that's why like being a DevOps engineer or finding the skill set is like really, really hard. And then we tend to make do with what we have, and then eventually it becomes harder. So what we are trying to really do is that it's not like we're trying to provide you that subject matter expertise. We are trying to basically take that requirement and see if we can create a digital version of it, like a digital DevOps engineer in the form of a Duplo Cloud platform, wherein you can say, look, you know what, this is what I need to do. And then can you just make sure that all the things are taken care of? And so that's sort of like what I would approach. Second thing, I think overall, I think it's very, very important to understand these nuances of around like lift and shift and repackaging and like rehosting and stuff. And because like the more you understand it, the better you understand it, all the trade-offs and so on, it'll make your cloud migration successful, because you don't want to basically get into a situation wherein like you migrated to cloud and it is like sort of worse than what it used to be. And then everybody sort of like blames each other. You talk to the CSP and the CSP is like, you're running a wrong architecture. Then you basically say, well, but we moved from the on-prem, we are all in the cloud. What happened to the promises of the cloud? And like, you don't want those kind of situations. So I would say vet the architecture with people with who have the right exposure and the experience. I'm sure, I mean, internally you will have a lot of them, but wherever it is necessary, talk to the cloud provider partners and so forth. And yeah, of course, I mean, DuploCloud, I already said, our goal is to basically see how we can take all this knowledge and put it into a software that people can just crank out. What Amazon and Azure did with infrastructure by creating infrastructure as a service, we are doing it to DevSecOps by creating DevSecOps as a service using software. That's how you would basically look at it. Plus, we have enough subject matter expertise to cover the edge cases and sort of like handhold you with fingers on the keyboard and white glove migration and so forth. Right. And yeah, I think that's sort of the recap. Yeah, I think we talked about that. Migration and modernization performed at $0. Well, what's the catch? The catch is a subscription fee. But then the good thing is that you can start paying us only when we have delivered a significant outcome. Like you can basically, we always have a 30-day probation period, and you can say that during that time, I need to make sure that I have all the validation. From my perspective, throw your entire year's roadmap at me in that 30 days. I mean, if you have to extend it, that's fine. And then we sort of like go from there. So we're really outcome driven, right? So we are not trying to charge time and material. So that's that. Customers are at the steering wheel. Everything is transparent. It all runs in your cloud account. DuploCloud itself runs in your cloud account. You have full transparency of seeing whatever is going on behind the scenes. You can basically look at the cloud provider and whatnot. And at any point of time, you can take over and then start driving the system, which is really what we want after some time. And yeah, I think 90% is self-service. I would say everything else can be covered using either in-house DevOps teams, or of course there is always our support team. Yeah, I think if you're interested, you can always book a demo, and I'll be happy to come on the call and then take details into your specific use cases and sort of like give you a roadmap. If you just want to chat, that's fine too. All right, please feel free. Our solutions engineers are happy to talk to you. We have like 150 customers, right? We're growing like 100% year over year in customer count. We are incentivized by cloud providers to actually do this. So there's a lot of validation. I mean, as a business, we have raised over 50 million. I mean, what I meant to say is that a lot of people have put critical infrastructure, put their money. There's a lot of trust that the industry has on DuploCloud. So we are not novices. So in that sense, I think if you find it meaningful, we can take it from there. We can go to questions now.
Thank you, Venkat. Thank you, Prashant. Yeah, if you are interested in even considering a cloud migration, book a demo with us today. We will kind of take you through the process and help you kind of plan out the future.